The day my brother popped champagne over our father's coffin. When my brother uncorked a bottle of champagne at our father's will reading, I realized money could make grief look elegant. The sound echoed through the paneled office like a gunshot-sharp final and cruelly celebratory. 2 weeks after we buried him, Grant Harlow was already toasting his inheritance. I sat across the mahogany desk, fingers clasped to stop the trembling. The smell of cigar smoke still haunted the room, mixed with the faint salt of Charleston air that slipped through the cracked window. My father had loved that mix wealth and decay holding hands. I'm Elliot Harlow, 45 years old, high school chemistry teacher, the family's quiet mistake. While Grant had spent his adult life closing hotel deals over scotch, I'd been grading lab reports under fluorescent lights. He inherited our father's ambition. I inherited his silence. Patricia Monroe, my father's longtime lawyer, cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. By the last will and testament of Richard Harlow, she began reading from the document, as if each word carried weight enough to break the table. Grant was already smiling that half-smile of someone who's never doubted the outcome. When Patricia listed the hotels, the investments, the cars, the downtown properties, he nodded like an emperor approving his own coronation. To my eldest son, Grant Harlow, I leave the entirety of Harlow Hospitality Holdings and all associated assets valued at approximately $60 million. Grant raised his glass. To Dad, he said, glancing at me, and to keeping the business in capable hands. He sipped, savoring his victory. Patricia hesitated before turning the page. And to my younger son, Elliot Harlow, Grant smirked. Don't strain yourself, Patty. He's probably getting Dad's old golf clubs. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached under the desk. When she set the item in front of me, the paper wrapping crinkled like old skin. Inside was a briefcase, cracked leather handle, split, brass corners green with age. It smelled faintly of smoke and regret. This, Patricia said quietly, was your father's specific instruction. He wanted you to have it. Grant laughed full and loud, leaning back in his chair. A broken briefcase, perfect match for his broken career. I didn't respond. I ran my fingers along the seams of the leather, feeling the dryness, the weight of something unspoken. Patricia's eyes flickered toward me, then down again. For the briefest moment, I thought she might cry. Grant was still talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore. There was something about that case, something heavier than its weight. Patricia finally said, almost under her breath, "Your father was very clear, Mr. Harlow. He wanted you to keep this safe. Safe." The word hung in the air like a secret. Grant snorted. Safe from what termites, Patricia didn't answer. She just kept watching me like she was waiting for me to notice something everyone else had missed. And in that moment, as the champagne fizzed beside my brother's glass, I realized the real inheritance wasn't what he'd been given. It was what I'd been trusted to discover. I drove home that evening with the briefcase on the passenger seat, as if it were alive and watching me. Every turn of the wheel made the cracked leather creak faintly, a sound that somehow felt older than me. The Charleston sun had already fallen behind the live oaks, and the streets shimmered with the last orange glow of a dying day. My brother's laughter still echoed in my head, that polished, hollow sound of someone who'd never been afraid of being forgotten. At home, I placed the briefcase on my kitchen table. It looked even more out of place under the cold white light, like a relic pulled from a fire that hadn't finished burning. I poured myself a glass of water, but it tasted like dust. I'd barely touched the latch before I smelled it faint, smoky, almost chemical. the scent of something that had survived heat and time. When I turned it over, I saw it a small scorch mark near the bottom corner, dark and irregular, as if the leather had been seared decades ago. Right above it, barely visible, was a faint engraving, HC 1978. The numbers stopped me cold. I knew that year. 1978, the year of the Harlow Hotel fire, the one in Savannah, that nearly destroyed my father's first property. 3 people had died, or so the papers said, but the investigation went quiet after a few months. Dad never spoke of it again. When I once asked him about it as a boy, he'd said, "Some things build a man, others bury him. Learn the difference." Now that memory felt heavier than ever. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn, my stepmother. She'd married Dad after Mom passed when I was in college. Her voice was polished, careful, like every word was rehearsed. "Evelyn," I said softly, "there's something I need to ask you. About Dad. And the old Savannah Hotel." There was a pause, a long one. I could hear her breathing. Then a faint click. The line went dead. I stared at the silent phone, unsure if it was fear or guilt that made her hang up. Outside, the night settled in the kind of southern quiet that feels almost staged. The cicadas had stopped, and even the street seemed to be holding its breath. I looked back at the briefcase. For a moment I thought I saw smoke rising from the small scorch mark, but it was only the reflection of my lamp. Still, I turned it off. The next morning, a letter slid under my door. The envelope was cream-colored, unmarked. No return address. Inside was a single page written in precise, slanted handwriting. Elliot. If you ever decide to open it, don't do it alone. Patricia M. I read the line again and again until the words blurred. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something stronger than anger, fear, quiet and methodical, the kind that doesn't shout but waits. I looked at the briefcase once more. The light of morning hit the engraving just right, and I saw what I'd missed before, not HC, but HCH, the initials for Harlow Court Hotel. The place that burned in 1978. The place that made my father rich and turned 3 people into ashes with no names. And somewhere inside that briefcase I knew was the reason he'd left it to me, not as an heirloom, but as a confession. I barely slept that night. The briefcase sat in the kitchen like a silent guest I couldn't ask to leave. Every time the house settled or the pipes clicked, I found my eyes drifting back to it, that small, burned corner gleaming under the streetlight, whispering something I wasn't ready to hear. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to open it alone. Patricia's warning had settled in my gut like lead. At Lincoln High, the halls smelled faintly of floor wax and old coffee. I slipped into the workshop behind the science wing, where the air was heavy with grease and sawdust. Marla Jennings was already there, goggles pushed up in her hair, denim sleeves rolled, humming along to a radio playing old Fleetwood Mac. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. Elliot Harlow. You only come down here when something's broken, which, knowing you, is usually your patience or your coffee maker. This time, I said, setting the briefcase on her workbench, it's neither. Marla wiped her hands on a rag and leaned closer. That's not just old, that's ancient. Where'd you get it? My father's will. She gave a low whistle. Your dad always scared me. Even his briefcase looks like it holds a grudge. I tried to smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. Can you open it without damaging it? She examined the locks like a surgeon assessing an old wound. These are German 60s, maybe. Solid brass. Haven't seen this style in years. She pulled a set of tiny picks from a drawer and got to work. If I break it, you can tell your brother I owe him $1. Or 60 million. I didn't laugh. The workshop filled with the soft tick of metal tools, the occasional scratch of her file against the latch. I stood there surrounded by machines and half-finished student projects, and realized how out of place this briefcase looked in a room built for learning. It belonged to another era, one with darker lessons. After several minutes, the first lock gave a quiet click. Marla froze, then smiled. Got it. The second fought harder. She frowned, applying gentle pressure. This one's fused may be heat damage. I'll try something slower. She switched tools, worked patiently, almost reverently, until the second latch surrendered with a soft, metallic sigh. When she lifted the lid, the hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, a single sealed envelope with my name on it, written in my father's handwriting, steady, deliberate. Beneath it lay a small brass key and a folded sheet of yellowed paper. Marla stepped back. You want me to? No, I said quietly. I'll do it. I opened the envelope. The air smelled faintly of smoke and ink. The note inside was short, only a few words in that same precise hand for Elliot. After I'm gone. First Federal Bank. Box 2189. Ask for Mr. Rowe. My throat went dry. Marla read over my shoulder. That bank closed years ago, she murmured. They moved their records and safe deposits to Atlanta, I think. I looked at the brass key. It was small, worn smooth from years of being hidden, yet it felt strangely heavy in my palm. Atlanta. I repeated more to myself than to her. Marla gave me a long, searching look. Whatever your father was keeping locked up that long, she said maybe it wasn't meant to stay buried forever. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the workshop windows, turning the dust in the air to gold. And for the first time since my father's death, I felt something flicker beneath the grief. Not hope exactly, but the sharp, undeniable pull of unfinished business. The following week, I drove to Atlanta with the brass key wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked inside my coat pocket. The interstate was long and empty, lined with leafless oaks and billboards for roadside diners that hadn't changed since the 70s. The hum of the tires gave rhythm to my thoughts, but no peace. Every mile felt like a step deeper into a life I'd never been meant to know. Marla had offered to come with me. I told her no. Some journeys are meant to be walked in silence. The new First Federal Bank stood like a monument to permanent's tall limestone columns, brass doors that caught the morning light, and an air-conditioned chill that didn't belong in spring. I stepped inside and waited behind a young mother, depositing checks, a businessman tapping his pen against his phone. It all looked so ordinary that for a moment I wondered if the note had been a cruel joke. When it was my turn, I slid the piece of paper across the counter. I'm here about a safety deposit box, I said. Number 2189. The teller. A young woman named Miranda, according to her badge, began typing. Halfway through, her fingers froze. She looked up, then back down at the screen, her lips parting slightly. One moment, please. She disappeared through a door behind her station. I waited, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The lobby clock ticked louder than it should have. When she returned, an older man was with her gray hair combed neatly back, suit pressed to perfection. His name tag read, Harold Rowe Branch President. Mr. Harlow, he asked. His voice was calm, but his eyes, pale blue and sharp, seemed to study my face for something beyond recognition. Yes, I managed. He exhaled slowly. Your father told me you'd come one day, he said quietly, but I didn't believe he meant it literally. Before I could respond, he gestured toward a hallway. "Follow me, please." We walked past offices and into a restricted corridor lined with framed photos of the bank's founders. Each step echoed on the marble floor. At the end of the hallway, he swiped a card, and a heavy door slid open with a mechanical sigh. The elevator descended longer than I expected, the kind of descent that feels more like being buried than transported. When the doors opened, cool filtered air greeted us, the kind meant for preserving paper and secrets. The vault was a cathedral of silence. Rows of steel boxes lined the walls, each with 2 locks, one for the bank, one for the owner. Rowe stopped at the far end. "Box 2189, he said. "We've kept it undisturbed since 1978. He handed me a small velvet tray. "Your key." My hands shook as I placed the brass key into the right slot. Rowe inserted his own, and together we turned them. The lock gave a solid click, the sound of something ending or beginning. Inside was a metal container the size of a loaf of bread. I set it on the table, my reflection warping across its surface. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Bundles of aged bills lay stacked in neat rows, U.S. currency gold certificates, bearer bonds, all marked with dates from the late 1970s. Beneath them, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, were several documents stamped FBI, confidential, and at the very bottom, a photograph. It was my father, younger, thinner, standing beside another man who looked like me. The resemblance was so sharp it made my stomach turn. "Who is this?" I whispered. Rowe didn't answer right away. His face had gone pale. "You should be careful, Mr. Harlow," he said softly. Some truths were never meant to be reopened. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then again. In the dimness, a voice young, urgent, came from behind me. It was the teller, Miranda, standing at the doorway. Her expression was strained. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling, "you shouldn't be down here." And just like that, the lights went out. When the lights came back on, everything in the vault seemed sharper, colder, like the air itself had shifted. Mr. Rowe stood still beside me, his hand resting on the edge of the metal table. The young teller was gone. Only the faint echo of her warning lingered in the concrete walls. I looked down at the open container again. The photograph lay there, accusing and unyielding. My father, or the man I'd always believed was my father, stood beside another man whose face might as well have been my own. The same eyes, the same jawline, a mirror carved 40 years apart. Who was he? I asked, my voice thin in the silence. Rowe hesitated before answering. His name was Anthony Caruso. I waited, but he didn't elaborate. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a word I'd known once as a child, but forgotten how to pronounce. When I lifted the photograph, another document slid free from beneath it, a birth certificate. My birth certificate. Except the father's name wasn't Richard Harlow. It was Anthony Caruso. My hands began to shake. I scanned the rest of the folder: financial records, partnership contracts, letters signed by both men. One in particular caught my attention: Harlow and Caruso. Development Agreement, 1976. Investment capital, 2,000,000. Source, Caruso. Holdings, Chicago. $2 million. Enough to build an empire in 1976. Enough to start a hotel chain. And there, scrawled in Richard Harlow's unmistakable handwriting, was a clause: in the event of either partner's death, ownership to transfer to the surviving partner, with the exception of one heir, the firstborn male child of Anthony Caruso. I sank into the metal chair, the sound echoing off the vault walls. Rowe spoke quietly, almost as if confessing. Your father Richard wasn't a bad man, but he lived with secrets that weren't entirely his to keep. The FBI came to him after the fire. The fire, I repeated. The Harlow Court Hotel. He nodded. That explosion wasn't an accident. Anthony Caruso was cooperating with the Bureau on a money laundering investigation. The people he was exposing made sure he didn't live long enough to testify. The edges of the world blurred. I remembered being a boy, maybe 5, sitting in the back seat of my father's car as we drove past the blackened shell of that hotel. I'd asked him what happened there. He'd said a man lost everything he built, and sometimes that's the price for being honest. I'd thought he was talking about himself. Rowe continued, his voice steady but low. 3 people died that night. The papers named them all Caruso, his driver, and an unidentified man believed to be an FBI agent. But there was supposed to be a 4th victim. Who Caruso's wife? But her body was never found. My throat went dry. You're saying she survived? Rowe's eyes met mine. She did. Richard helped her disappear. He gave her a new name, and he raised her son as his own. The vault seemed to close in around me, the air too thin to breathe. I thought of Evelyn's silence on the phone, Patricia's trembling hands, my father's final words in the will, keep it safe. Safe from whom? Safe from me. Somewhere buried in all those lies was the truth my father had died protecting. He hadn't betrayed a friend. He'd buried one and raised his son instead. And the man I'd spent my whole life trying to impress was never my father at all. I drove back to Charleston that night without turning on the radio. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, black and silver under the sweep of my headlights. The city lights faded behind me, swallowed by the weight of what I'd learned. Every mile felt heavier than the last, like the truth itself was riding in the passenger seat beside me, silent and unforgiving. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to the law office on Broad Street, where the faint glow of a desk lamp still burned in the window. Patricia Monroe was working late. She always did. She looked up when I stepped through the door. The sight of me made her freeze, pen still in hand. "Elliot," she said quietly. "I was expecting you, just not tonight." I placed the folder on her desk. The photo, the birth certificate, the partnership contract. "How long have you known?" Her lips tightened, but her eyes softened with something that might have been pity. "Since before you were born," she whispered. "Your father, Richard, made me promise to protect you, no matter what." I sat down across from her. "Protect me from what, Patricia?" "From who I am." She hesitated, then reached for a glass paperweight on her desk, a habit I'd seen her do when she needed courage. Anthony Caruso's death was supposed to close the book on an entire investigation, but it didn't. The Bureau couldn't make the case stick without him, so they made a deal with Richard. He took the money, built the hotels, and kept his mouth shut. In exchange, they protected your mother and you. My chest felt hollow. So everything, the empire, the reputation, the fortune, all of it came from blood money? Patricia shook her head slowly. Not blood money. Redemption money. Anthony wanted to invest in something clean, something legitimate before the world caught up to him. He gave your father $2 million to build a business that could outlive their mistakes. And Richard did exactly that. She pulled out another file from a locked drawer, its edges worn, the paper yellowed with age. But there was one condition. She laid it in front of me. A supplemental agreement witnessed, notarized, and hidden from everyone but me. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Anthony Caruso. Upon the son of Anthony Caruso, reaching the age of 45, 35% of Harlow Hospitality Holdings shall transfer to his legal possession regardless of lineage claim or current ownership. I stared at the words until they blurred. 35%, I said quietly. Patricia nodded. You turn 45 in 11 months. The room seemed to tilt. Grant's going to fight this. He already is, she said. He's been digging since the funeral. He just doesn't know what he's looking for. And when he finds out, he'll do anything to bury it again. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Elliot, listen to me. This contract can destroy your brother, the company, maybe even your father's legacy. But if it becomes public, the media will turn your family into a feeding frenzy. The headlines will write themselves, "Mob money built Southern Empire." I felt my throat tighten. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend. None of this happened. Patricia looked at me not like a lawyer, but like someone who'd carried a secret too long. You don't have to expose him, she said. You just have to decide whether you still want to live in his shadow, or step into the light your real father left for you. Her words lingered long after I left. The night air outside was thick with humidity, heavy and unmoving. Somewhere above the city, thunder rolled across the horizon, a sound that felt less like warning and more like permission. For the first time, I wasn't sure which father I was betraying by telling the truth, or which one I'd betray by staying silent. The storm that had been hovering over Charleston finally broke the next morning. I drove through sheets of rain, Patricia's words echoing in my mind. Step into the light your real father left for you. But the truth wasn't light. It was something heavier, older. It pressed on my chest with every mile I drove south. I had one stop left. The address Patricia had written on the back of the contract was in Tampa, Florida, a small coastal town where the streets smelled like salt and sunscreen. The sign outside read, Sunny Harbor Retirement Community, the kind of place built for people who've stopped expecting surprises. At the front desk, the nurse looked at me carefully when I asked for Lillian Caruso. She hesitated, then said, We don't have anyone by that name, sir. I slid Patricia's note across the counter. The nurse's eyes flicked over it, then back at me. Room 2114, she said quietly. She goes by Lillian Hartman now. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and old photographs. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I'd imagined this moment 100 ways, her face, her voice, what I might say. But none of those versions prepared me for what waited inside. She was sitting by the window, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, watching rain gather on the glass. Her hair was silver thin, but her posture was graceful, almost deliberate. When she turned her eyes, my eyes met mine without surprise. I knew you'd come, she said softly. Her voice carried both relief and exhaustion. You look so much like him. I stepped closer. Anthony Caruso. Her lips trembled. He was your father, yes, but Richard raised you. And that was the bravest thing a man ever did. I didn't speak. She motioned for me to sit. The chair creaked the air between us, filling with the hum of distant thunder. Richard wasn't cruel, Elliot, she said, her gaze steady. He kept you small so you could stay alive. Every time he criticized you, every time he called you a disappointment, it wasn't hate. It was protection. I felt something tighten in my chest. Protection from what? From the people who killed your father, she whispered. The Caruso name was poison in those days. Richard made sure it was buried along with who you really were. He built that empire so you'd have a future that didn't end in a grave. Outside, lightning flashed, throwing her reflection against the window. For a moment I saw her younger, the woman from the photographs, smiling beside two men who would both die for her in different ways. There's something else you should know, she continued. Grant knows. He's always known. I looked up sharply. What he found out years ago, she said. Your father told him when he turned 21. He wanted Grant to protect you too. But greed does strange things to men. Grant made sure the papers disappeared, the contract, the files, everything that could ever connect you to Anthony. The room grew quiet, except for the rain. He thought if he buried the truth, she said he could keep it all for himself. But secrets don't stay buried, Elliot. They grow roots. They come looking for air. She reached for my hand, her fingers fragile but steady. When you go back, don't hate Richard for what he did. Don't even hate your brother. Just make sure the truth doesn't die with them. I nodded, though the words caught somewhere between my throat and heart. As I stood to leave, she whispered, almost to herself, "Your father died trying to do the right thing. Richard lived pretending he didn't. Now it's your turn to decide which one of them you'll be." Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, the kind that follows a storm. But as I walked back to my car, I knew the real storm hadn't even begun. I drove back to Charleston with the kind of stillness that only comes after revelation, not peace exactly, but something quieter than rage. The truth had finally drawn its shape, and it looked nothing like vengeance. By the time I reached the glass tower that bore my family's name, Harlow Hospitality Holdings, the morning sun had broken through the clouds gleaming off the mirrored windows. It was strange how beautiful the building looked, knowing what it had been built on: lies, loyalty, and one man's silent promise. I carried the restored briefcase in one hand, its leather polished, the brass corners gleaming again. Inside were the documents that could rewrite everything: my birth certificate, the Caruso contract, Patricia's affidavit, and a sealed letter from the FBI confirming the witness protection arrangement that had hidden my mother and me for 45 years. The receptionist hesitated when she saw me. "Mr. Harlow isn't expecting you," she said gently. "That's all right," I replied. "He's been expecting this." When I entered the boardroom, the conversation died instantly. Grant sat at the head of the table, surrounded by executives, his Rolex glinting as he gestured mid-sentence. His smile faltered when he saw me. "Elliot," he said slowly, "you're not supposed to be here." I placed the briefcase on the table, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Neither were you," I said. "At least not entirely." He frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" I slid the documents across the polished oak. "It means this company isn't just yours. It never was. It was built with two names, Harlow and Caruso, and I carry both." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Grant stood abruptly, color rising in his face. "You're a fraud," he shouted. "A jealous little teacher trying to steal what you never earned." I didn't raise my voice. "No, brother," I said quietly. "I'm the son Dad protected, the one he loved enough to hide." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Grant's eyes darted to the papers, to our father's handwriting, to the old FBI seal, to the signatures that could not be forged. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked smaller than I remembered, not weak, just human. "You think this makes you one of us?" he said finally. "It makes me what I've always been," I answered. "Family. The part Dad couldn't acknowledge in public but never stopped guarding in private." Patricia was there, standing in the corner, her expression unreadable. She broke the silence. "The law is clear, Grant. 35% transfers immediately. Your father made sure of it." Grant sank into his chair. No more shouting. Just the sound of his own defeat filling the space. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the briefcase, and turned toward the door. At the threshold, I looked back once, not at him, but at the empty chair beside his, the one my father used to sit in. Outside, Charleston sunlight hit me full in the face. The air smelled faintly of salt and magnolia. I walked down the marble steps with the briefcase in hand, the same one that had once been an insult now shining like forgiveness. I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance. The next month, the company changed its name, Harlow Caruso Hospitality Group. The new plaque gleamed in the lobby, half in shadow, half in light, just like the men who built it. As I stood there during the unveiling, reporters shouted questions, flashes went off, and the world finally learned the truth. I said only one thing before I walked away. He gave me nothing, but left me everything. What did this story make you feel? Anger? Hope? Forgiveness? I'd love to know. Where you're watching from, drop your city or country in the comments below and share your thoughts with our community. Don't forget to subscribe to Domestic Tragedy for more true-to-life stories of family loss and redemption that touch the heart and stay with you long after the screen fades.